Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. If I speak like this, can you hear me? Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. الفاتحة لمن وأسلافنا الصالحين وبنية أن الله ينور قلوبنا وقوالبنا مع التقى والهدى والعفاف والغنى والموت على دين الإسلام والإيمان بلا محنة ولا امتحان بحق سيدي ولد عدنان ولكل نية صالحة وإلى حضرة النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم بسر الأسرار الفاتحة. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. All right. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah, we gather again to resume our discussion on the history of ethics, or the science of ethics, and we are now discussing the secularization and its contribution towards the rise of a new ethical tradition, shall we say. And if we notice that we have been focusing thus far on how crucial events in history has brought about a new era, and this has something to do with what the historians have determined as part of the crucible of history, that there would be certain major events in history that occurred that signals the rise of a new era. And in Western consciousness, especially since the Enlightenment and more recent scholarship, for their own understanding of their own history, of their own reading of the development of their history, they have been accustomed to dividing history into three major eras. The one, what they call the classical age, the age in which the Greek philosophers and the early birth of the Western consciousness was considered, up to the age of the Romans and their appropriation of Greek ideas. Then, I suppose the major event that changed the course of history for Western civilization was the introduction of Christianity. Of course, the introduction of Christianity highlighted for many of the Western historians the slow but sure beginnings of the Middle Ages, or the medieval ages, meaning to say crucial events in between the classical age and the modern age. As for the modern age, the new age, shall we say, there were crucial events that had happened in between. Yes, of course, the Middle Ages, if we study more, if we scrutinize the development of the history, was a long process from the decline and fall of the Roman Empire to the rise of Christianity, the rise of the Holy Roman Empire, until gradually they come into contact with Islamic civilization. They initiated the second half, or what they call the higher Middle Ages, the rise of the universities and the new methods of thinking. And oh, I'm sorry. Hello. One of the participants said that he cannot hear anything. Is he the only one, or am I? Can everyone else hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. Good. All right. I was worried. I was speaking to myself. At any rate, so I was talking about the how history is carved and how it is divided as a framework in order to understand different ages, and within the large outline of the three-part history, the classical, the medieval, and the modern, there are several distinct ages, as we have seen, like what they call the Renaissance, rebirth, in which Western man rediscovered their classical learning, albeit being quite developed, because it has been elaborated by Muslim civilization. Um, yes, until gradually they arrive at the age of the Enlightenment. So when we speak about ethics, therefore, since ethics is, if we go by the standards of the scientific discussion of one's worldview, we will know that ethics. I'm getting people entering the waiting room. Are they? Can the hosts settle this, whether to admit or not? Yes. Yes. All right. Anyways, okay then. Thank you. Um, yes, as I was saying, I never used to get this side of notifications. All right. Uh, okay. To return to the subject matter of ethics and how ethics stand in relation to the other conceptions in philosophy. When we speak about the scientific discussion of one's worldview, usually, um, since the worldview is a reflection of your mind's conception of what it considers to be real and true, perhaps the simplest structure that the mind would build about its external reality, not only based on sense experience, but also based on culture and education, would be the life structure. Gradually you would come to understand, yes, based on your biological needs and based on the the cultural appropriation through concepts, your conception of reality would then form a basic life structure. Gradually the mind might arrive at an understanding of the world that sustains, that supports the possibility of life. Yes. uh, of course, as it becomes more complex, and if supposing you wish to ask, or supposing the sophistication of your worldview admits of the possibility of explaining how the world came about, what are its most important principles, and if you have a principle of learning and so on, then within your worldview structure would emerge something called the knowledge structure also. uh, and of course, these distinctions are only possible in as a matter of discussion, but in truth, they are all interrelated. The more complex structure is the ethical structure or the axiological structure, the value structure, what you consider to be most important. So therefore, ethical historians, um, like McIntyre, like John Rawls, and several others who have taught history of moral philosophy, history of ethics, what they tend to do is to look at the changes in metaphysics, or the changes in important changes in worldview, because that is how the ethics will likewise be changed. And certainly, it is not just changes in worldview through, say, the introduction of religion, or the reappropriation of one's cultural roots that changes your value structure, but also uh, the development of science, because the development of science in turn also influence your conception of reality and conception of values, and at the same time changes in your conception of economics and social structures, they also lead to changes in your conception of ethics. All right. And when we look at this, when we look at history, or when the history of ethics in this more holistic framework, you will then be able to understand which moments in the history of thought are most interesting for the history of ethics. And that is why the choice has not been arbitrary, that we have chosen, for example, the Greek period, and then the Christian period, and then in the last meeting we discussed the Islamic conception, with one discussion on the Hellenistic period of philosophy. Right now, as we enter into modernity, the crucial events that had happened included, of course, the Renaissance, but also the discovery of the world, And in metaphysics, or in their conception of reality, it is the development and the rise of science and technology. First, we had the Francis Bacon's critique of scholasticism as a valid method to understanding reality. Remember, in the 13th century and earlier, when Thomas Aquinas and the other university theologians were the ones who are most active in defining the scientific conception of reality, scriptural revelation did play a role. Metaphysical philosophy also did play a role in their determining the world structure and ultimately the value structure. But with the rise of modern science, of course, Bacon is an important figure, where, say, naturalism became developed on the plane of inductive thought. But at the same time, we had several revolutions in science, which has a bearing on metaphysics. First was the Copernican revolution, and then gradually, and then later on, the Galilean revolution. Of course, the Galilean revolution is in truth part and parcel of the Copernican revolution. The change in man's conception of our relationship to the celestial object, from the from the geocentric model of the universe to the heliocentric of the model of the universe, brought about ripple actions or ripple effects in several disciplines. Not to mention, of course, the relationship of the public to the church, and challenge the authority of the medieval church in determining thought and in determining value structure. If the church and its pope, who was thought to be infallible, can be fundamentally wrong on very important matters, then it brings about reverberations in the understanding of the authority of the church. Gradually, that paves the road for the development of a new value structure, certainly. All that it was waiting for was a systematic thinker to bring about the ethical and moral repercussions of the loss of authority of the church in becoming the sole determiner of the worldview of the people. And this is part and parcel of what is called the secularization thesis. According to several secularization theorists, like say Professor Casanova, like John Berger, and then more recently the Canadian McGill uh, professor, who wrote Charles Taylor, who wrote The Secular Age. He was trying to outline there are several differences in the secularization. There are several senses when you speak about secularization. On the one hand, secularization, as earlier conceived, based on Schiller and Max Weber and even Freud and several other theorists, which was also adopted by Harvey Cox, and then, of course, reinterpreted but absorbed also by Professor Alatas in his conception of secularization. Secularization here is understood as the uh, the disenchantment of nature that comes about as a result of rationalization. Yes, rationalization, or the removal of spiritual forces, comes about due to uh, the reduction of man's epistemic powers to disclose reality via the spirit, and the rejection and the development of science in tandem with that. So that secularization was called by Charles Taylor, if I'm not mistaken, as secularization one. There is also the secularization that was happening in the public social sphere, and this the one that is related to the 30 Years' War, related to the clash of the Protestants against the Catholics, and the rise of the toleration, of the need of the doctrine of toleration and John Locke's treatises and so on. Meaning to say, secularization in the political sphere, which includes, of course, the economic aspect of secularization, in which the powers of the church were greatly reduced. That also became part and parcel of the rise of the modern nation states and the strengthening of secular governments, which of course is intertwined with secularization one, but also it can be understood separately, at least in discussion. But Charles Taylor also said that there is a third consideration when we speak about secularization. And secularization three, in this case, is the rise of a new type of society. Yes, a rise of a new type of society, which is much different from earlier periods, what he calls the secular age. Because in earlier periods, and I think that experience is perhaps more authentic when describing Western culture and civilization. There was a moment in which, under pastoral care, the church and its monopoly of power, its authority in determining the secular affairs, became the not only an entity that held both secular and ecclesiastical power, but at the same time they also, due to their externalization of their power, also made it virtually inconceivable for anyone, at least publicly, to hold contrary beliefs against the doctrinal positions of the church. Now, secularization three then is the removal of that cultural setting, to the extent that in more recent decades, or in the last 1 or 2 centuries, it became even for the staunchest believer, that his position with regards to reality, with regards to theism, is a personal choice that he cannot force upon another person. This is secularization three. And why is it important to speak about these things? I mean, especially with regards to secularization three, in order to understand the rise of new ethics, it's because even the churchmen, those who were devout Christians, they were already, shall we say, occupying this position. In particular, when we speak about the rise of modern ethics, we have to scrutinize the role of, first Calvin, or rather first Martin Luther, and secondly Calvin, because these two theologians, despite their break, or despite their break from the Roman Catholics, and their new efforts of their new understanding of epistemology. I mean, they still accepted scriptural revelation, but with regards to the authority of, say, determining the meaning of revelation, they put greater emphasis on the scripture in itself, sola scriptura, which is different, say, from the Catholic tradition that has grown as an empire, that has grown as an intellectual tradition, but at the same time a church married with a certain power structure. When we look at the ethics of Martin Luther, or the ethics of John Calvin, we are now observing real changes with regards to value systems, because Luther and Calvin found not much problem with the secular princes and the secular autonomous governments, and they were, well, at least insofar as economics is concerned, they were tending towards greater economic authority, or rather greater economic autonomy. Calvin wrote a defense of usury, in which he likened usury to rent, and this is very crucial. And I think Max Weber has summarized this very well in his groundbreaking work in history of economics, or in sociology, the the secular ethics and the rise or rather the Protestant ethics and the rise of capitalism. We can also read a reworking of the same phenomena in history by, I believe, the economic historian, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. At any rate, these two thinkers, they were devout Christians, and where their theology is concerned, they were people who, I mean, Luther at least, advocated the notion of justification by grace, not justification by good works. They put ethics securely on the principle of the individual, and that is for the individual to acknowledge his sinfulness before God. So the ethics of Luther and later on Calvin highlighted the role of happiness to be found within to be found within oneself, not in external changes of society. But when churchmen decided to turn their ethical attention within and not without, that prepares the road for, shall we say, the secular minded and those with secular commitments to take control of the public sphere and to bring about a rise of a new secular ethics. Would you excuse me for a while? Mami, daripada mana? Yes. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right then. Okay. So if you can hear what I said about perhaps the role of Luther and Calvin in preparing for secularization three, they were insofar as their worldviews. Well, who knows what was happening really in their minds, but um, as far as their writings are concerned, and in their worldviews, they haven't secularized in the extent that they perceive nature to be disenchanted, but in their ethics, because they advocated the ethics of turning within and leading them to challenge the moral authority of the church, and that prepared the road, as I said, for the rise of a secular ethics. And with the rise of these secular princes who worked together with the Protestant forces, gradually what we saw Europe being engulfed in internecine strife, in internal warfare between the different denominations. And this, of course, necessitated and invited the role of the thinkers, the political philosophers, to write on, say, the necessity of toleration, because now you have whereas previously they thought that, I mean, since Christianity were considered themselves to be a missionary religion and at the same time possessing absolute authority, they were unchallenged previously. But now within Christianity are two factions who consider each of them themselves being complete and authoritative. So they now will clash, certainly. So under this universalizing impact of these internal factions, what then was needed was a notion of toleration, of how they can tolerate each other, and this gradually prepares the ground for greater secularization too, as we're saying, meaning to say greater secularization of the external sphere. With that, and of course, as we were saying when we discussed the history of that period, there was also the rise of secular civilization in the form of the reappropriation of classical texts, and the redevelopment of Platonism, and the redevelopment and the refashioning of the Hellenistic ethics, yes, of Pyrrhonism. And I believe if you remember our course on the history of philosophy, we mentioned the role of the skeptics like Montaigne and so on. This prepares the ground alongside the Copernican revolution for some political philosophers and ethicists or moral philosophers to come up with a system which they think would reflect properly the changes in the sciences. So, such a person came in the personality of Thomas Hobbes. When we look at Thomas Hobbes, he was saying that the greatest discoveries of the 17th century was, of course, in the realm of anatomy and medicine. Harvey's, discovery of a more accurate description of the workings of the human body. And in the anatomy of the universe, Galileo Galilei, had helped consolidate the Copernican thesis through his accurate observations of the celestial spheres and his notion of inertia and his reworking of, through his dialogue of two systems, his reworking of an alternative cosmology. So similarly, then Hobbes thought that he was doing the same with regards to with the body politic, with regards to the society, and with regards to the body politic. Thomas Hobbes, as an Englishman, thought that he was on the brink of a discovery, that just as you can speak of the anatomy of the universe in the form of cosmology and the anatomy of the physical body in medicine, you can also speak of the anatomy of the body politic, and in which he was saying that he has gradually discovered the principles of how it is run and how it is established. Following the Euclidean geometrical method, Hobbes tried to establish, say, and this became the secular substitute of natural law, or the secular substitute of philosophy or ethics derived from scripture. His substitute was to push forth an understanding that supposing we don't speak about our ethics deriving from an absolute moral arbiter such as God, how then can we find out what is it that should be our moral standard? Well, for Hobbes, and later on we will see several other thinkers who follow along the same passion. We should try to determine what is it that every individual strives towards, and that is something inherently valuable. Yes. So for Hobbes, the number one and most important instinct that is shared by every human being is the instinct for self-preservation. The instinct for self-preservation is what drives every human individual. And he said that supposing we can all agree that everyone has an instinct for self-preservation, how then do you play it out that some societies are able to establish, peacemaking institutions, and other societies are stuck in states of nature? So there can be two models of society if individuals within that society pursue self-preservation. And supposing that premise number one, that all human beings value self-preservation, then uh, what then follows? He will say that, well, either they will work together and establish a polity, establish a commonwealth through which they will cede their authority. It is to the state, or to the sovereign of a state, which in this case is an artificial creation. But it is a brilliant artificial creation, because they to surrender their right to harm others, although they have a natural tendency because of their intention for self-preservation. If they were to cede this authority, to give it to the Leviathan, a biblical monster, shall we say, this artificial creation of the Commonwealth, then what would then happen? This artificial creation will perform this exchange with them, in that they supposing they take your weapons and they take your means to do violence, and they guarantee you that your life will be well preserved. And since you, through this contractual agreement, you agree to cede your authority to this Leviathan, then it becomes part and parcel of your interest, of your personal interest, to help develop community institutions and governmental institutions and all types of social institutions in order for the promotion of peace. And if you are now on this positive course, what will then happen? You will continue to enjoy the benefits of social living. On the other hand, if the instinct for self-preservation just now did not encounter the saving, shall we say, the saving possibilities of this social contract, what would happen? Well, then that instinct for self-preservation may become corrupted to the extent that people would start a war of all against all. And if that happens, then this war of all against all will lead to, conditions of living which is unfit for human beings, because you will forever live in terror. Life would be, solitary, brutish, nasty, and short, since everyone is out for himself. Even a person who may be stronger than others would not necessarily live in peace, because even the weak, even the strong will have to go to sleep. Yes. At any rate, this sort of thinking, yes, of the necessity to elect a sovereign and to cede authority to the sovereign may have some analogous um, discussions in the writings of, say, Muslim political philosophers or Muslim political theorists. We find in Raja Ali Haji's Tamaratul Muhimmah that he was discussing something of this type about the necessity to elect a leader, an imam, and he was saying that the valid way is through the election of the Ahlul Halli wal Aqdi, the people of authority, established authority, who derives the authority ultimately from revelation, from the prophet. Yes. And due to the election of the Ahlul Halli wal Aqdi, the people of true authority, they become the representative of the people. But he does not exclude the possibility that sometimes succession, or rather that, yes, that rule can be acquired through succession. Yes, like when a king nominates his successor, that is also a valid manner. And thirdly, he talks about taghallab, the idea that a sovereign rises to power by, say, say, means of violence or aggression or conquest. But when the king becomes sovereign, that you ought to recognize his authority, because if you do not, then it would lead to continuous internecine strife. This is, of course, different from Thomas Hobbes's idea in fundamental ways, because we have still the governance of scripture, and we have the governance of the ethical commitments and demands of our understanding of reality and truth. But nevertheless, the Hobbesian conception of society also has bearings on his ethical theories. Uh, the idea is that, being a modern political philosopher and ethicist, Hobbes establishes a new tradition in ethics, wherein now you are free to develop your own elaborate conception of political philosophy, ethical philosophy, independent of any scriptural demands or commands, such that later on the same model was developed by the likes of Spinoza, Descartes, Leibniz. These were all amongst the early political philosophers who developed their political and ethical theories in relation to how they are perceiving the external changes in their society and community. All right. Yes. Of course, when it comes to ethics, we know that the goal of ethics is still the individual, and it is the happiness of the individual ultimately that is the ultimate concern. When we look at the development of ethical tradition, pace or after Hobbes, uh, theories of happiness were developed. Of course, they were highly influenced by the Hellenistic philosophers. Spinoza was certainly influenced by the Stoics and their notion of ataraxia. Uh, he wanted to develop an ethics of, uh, causal necessity, that real happiness rests in the freedom of knowledge, not in freedom of changing external society. But we see then, as the ethical tradition became more and more developed, you have the likes of, say, John Stuart Mill, who now perhaps challenges the Hobbesian thesis that it is ultimately the instinct of self-preservation that is the highest goal of mankind. Instead, he substituted that, because him coming from the tradition of utilitarians, saying that ultimately what is valued by human beings is happiness. But happiness here is defined more as absence of pain and the pursuit of pleasurable things. Yes, of course. At about the same time as Hobbes, or slightly earlier, you had the Machiavellian introduction in ethics, which is also very important, because Machiavelli uh, divorced religious ethics from politics. Religious ethics is one thing, but politics has as its goal uh, to secure power, as opposed to religious ethics, whose goal is piety. All right, then. I think what we will then now do is to hold it here, or rather to stop my lecture here and to allow for question and answers. I know that we have perhaps remaining 2 or 3 more lectures. I would like perhaps to discuss the ethical theories of David Hume and several others amongst the intuitionists, and maybe Kant in our latter half of modern philosophy or modern ethical theory. And then we will do 2 more sessions, I suppose, on special topics. One of them will be morality and the state, and the other would be the good society and the market, where one of them we will discuss the problems of political philosophy and personal ethics vis-a-vis the modern nation state, and in the other we will discuss the challenge of economic tradition in trying to become ethical. And if we have time to do also the critique of modern ethics. All right. Do we have any questions so far? Any questions? Well, I do remember that in some of our earlier meetings, we did have sessions in which there was no question. I believe that was the one on Hellenistic ethics, because they wanted time to allow the questions to brew. I'm okay with that. You can develop your questions throughout the week, and perhaps have them ready, inshallah, for our next meeting, in which we will deal with these matters in more detail. Oh, okay. Go on, Prof. Sapora. If you like to ask through speech, you can do that too. Okay. Right. What is the difference between ethics and cardinal virtues, um, as stated by Plato? Or perhaps, if I can reformulate that question, what is the difference between modern ethics premised upon the idea of values compared to classical ethics premised on the idea of virtues? Okay. So now, the difference between virtues and values is that in the classical formulation, in Plato and Aristotle, when they spoke about virtue, um, they spoke about what is meant by virtue in the Arabic fada'il is when we speak about the virtue of something, it means the well-functioning of something. Yes, the virtue of something means the well-functioning of something. And this is very closely interrelated with their understanding of psychology. So in Plato, but more definitely in Aristotle, when they spoke about the virtue of the human being, they distinguish between the different psychological aspects. Since within the human individual is a principle of intellect or thinking and rational thought, so the virtue of that faculty in man is wisdom, meaning to say thought which is properly exercised produces wisdom, both the theoretical as well as the practical. The virtue of the desirous aspect of man is prudence. Yes, prudence or iffah, that understanding or sometimes used as temperance, meaning to say the desire which has now been tempered, which is neither excessively extreme or extreme in excess or extreme in defect. So when we speak about the ethical system of the Greeks, which then was developed also by the Hellenistic peoples, they speak um, about changes in human behavior that is required in order to experience happiness. That happiness and the goal of ethics in the Greek sense is changing one's conduct, is changing one's conduct. And if one's conduct is properly practiced, then that is the goal of say ethical practice. In modern times, the the substitution of virtues to values meant that the sacrifice of virtues with regards to what one values higher than others. Look at what Hobbes said, that the highest virtue is the virtue of, or rather the highest value is the principle of self-preservation. So therefore, social arrangements is the one that needs to change in order to accommodate the human desire for self-preservation. And similarly, in the case of, say, John Stuart Mill, he brought about the utilitarian ball, the idea that happiness in the sense of pleasure is the goal of ethics. So therefore, politics needs to change in order to accommodate the maximalization or the maximization of happiness understood as pleasure. And that is why in connection with the pursuit of utility, you have also the defense of free speech, the vindication of the rights of women. Not to say that the vindication of the rights of women is intrinsically wrong or only consequential upon utilitarian ethics, but the idea is that if you believe in the principle of say the maximum amount of happiness to the biggest amount of happiness to the biggest amount of people, then you would not wish to exclude half of the population, which is women. So that's how modern ethics has changed, has shifted its focus compared to classical ethics. And even with the deontological school, like Immanuel Kant, who believed that ethics is a matter of duty. Now that duty, on the other hand, it becomes another extreme, because Kant does not equate duty with happiness. You are supposed to perform your moral duties irregardless of the experience of pleasure, pain, or happiness. Likewise, so that's one difference between, say, the ethics whose stress is upon values, and ethics whose stress is upon virtues. Now, the other question I notice here is on Friedrich Nietzsche and his contribution to modern ethics. Nietzsche introduced several theses, which I think is very important with regards to ethics. One is his notion of uh, the genealogy of ethics. And that's a very brilliant thesis, or should I say, a very influential tendency in the history of ethics, because what Nietzsche wants to perform is a reductionist view of ethics also. He wants to say, unlike Hobbes, who said that human beings have an instinct of self-preservation, for Nietzsche, every individual ultimately have a drive towards power. There is a will to power, ultimately. It is not just self-preservation. Self-preservation is a very weak manifestation of the will to power. The will to power is the ultimate goal of every organism in Nietzschean understanding. So if that is understood, then according to him, all the history of ethical systems, including religion, is but an expression of that desire, of the contest between the weak and the strong. Yes, strong individuals, yes, strong-willed individuals would like to promote an ethics that celebrates merit, that celebrates greatness, that celebrates glory. But weak ethics, meaning to say an ethics that is developed by the weak and the meek, by the mediocre, in order to curtail the excesses of the strong, will focus on redistribution, will focus on pity. Yes. So he now then projects this understanding of the basis of the will to power upon the history of ethics. And he has he tried to show, and in a convincing manner, I suppose, how the rise of Christianity is in truth the suppression of the powerful by the weak, because the weak has managed to express itself in in an ethical language to curtail the rights and powers of the strong. And his goal is to outline a new ethical system, a transvaluation of values. It's transvaluation of values, meaning to say he wants to reinterpret and redesign and rearrange the valuative systems so as to promote the creative geniuses, the creative individuals, and even megalomaniacs, those who desire power and who revel in power. So that's his. Of course, it gives rise to relativism, but it is a relativism that according to him, is the only type that is justifiable. He denies the existence of truth, of course. What there is a blind desire to power, and so he wishes, at least according to his own thought, to liberate those who are perhaps potentially strong to pursue their goal. Of course, this is if we study the impact upon human history, this would be destructive, certainly, if it fell upon the wrong hands. We know that historically, that amongst those who were either falsely influenced or rightly influenced by Nietzsche was none other than Hitler himself, because he used the ideas of Nietzsche to support the notion of a strong race that ought to oppress the weak race, and he translated this into a violent political ideology. Okay, can utilitarian ethics be applied in professional fields such as counseling and law? It will be against professionalism. Oh, well, of course, when we say it will be against professionalism, but what is professionalism premised upon? I mean, one's profession, yes, is the source of the ethics of professionalism. But whatever profession and whatever professionalism may mean, it must have some basis for its say ultimate bearings. and utilitarianism claims to be one such bearing. Which is why we will see that in certain societies where utilitarianism reigns supreme, there will be implications. And when I used to study, I think, health economics at the undergraduate level, at the third year undergraduate level, many economists tend to subscribe to the utilitarian idea. For them, which is why we will see in the recent pandemic, utilitarian ethics will surface in certain countries, in which they are willing to sacrifice the older members of their community for the sake of for the sake of the young. I remember reading several articles that certain experts, or certain utilitarians in some of these advanced countries were arguing against, say, measures of restrictive movement, or lockdown, because they were saying that the lockdown, in terms of its ultimate benefits, will benefit the old, in that it gives them life, but it will punish the young because it will impact them economically. And so if they can reduce everything to a utilitarian vector, they would want to suggest that it is better that we suffer the death of some old people now, rather than suffer the economic consequences the economic consequences of the greater number of the population, who are the youth, who has many years ahead of their lives. But whether or not this is correct or not is one thing. But the idea that I wish to highlight here is that utilitarianism remains a living, shall we say, a living school of thought that informs public health decisions, that informs even within the state, that informs, say, economic decisions. Macro as well as microeconomic decisions are being determined based on utilitarian principles for several countries, although that is balanced with several other schools. So, but if you're talking about fields, such as counseling and law, well, certainly there will be a moral dilemma, isn't it, for lawyers, for professional counselors, even for therapists. I mean, if you think about it seriously, I mean, uh, first, uh, if you think about, maximizing pleasure, is maximizing pleasure equal to be equated with maximizing happiness? Um, well, I don't think so. And we know that in many instances, how maximizing pleasure within the polity will end up detrimental to the development of the society. One such counterexample to the maximization of pleasure thesis is certainly the cyclical understanding of the rise of civilizations that has been theorized by Ibn Khaldun. We notice how the increase in luxury and the increase in sedentary lifestyle and the maximization of pleasure in this case will ultimately lead to the collapse of a civilization. So I would say that utilitarianism is in reality a sort of a biological measure to kill their civilization. Because I mean, if you truly wish to maximize pleasure, then that is won at the cost of, say, uh, you know, no need to go through any sort of pain, no need to go through no need to go through any sort of sacrifice. Utilitarianism perhaps would even question the need to, say, for conscription. Yeah, exactly. Yes. that this having affair with the with the client may appear to be promoting happiness both in the case of the client and happiness in the case of the counselor. But if he or she is not governed by a higher principle of ethics, already now we can see in this case, that it produces a moral dilemma, because supposing it is not in the benefit of here is the crucial weakness of utilitarianism. Look at how they say that since everyone values happiness, therefore it is rational to promote a social philosophy that promotes maximum happiness. In truth, although it is true that everyone values happiness, it is not true that everyone wishes other people to be happy too. There is this instinctive individualistic desire in the human nafs that wishes happiness for himself, not for others, isn't it? I mean, we will notice how utilitarianism seems to fall in line with the capitalist ethics, with the yes with the capitalist ethos, in which the powerful would only wish to be more powerful, and they would manipulate, and they would develop mechanisms through which they can continuously manipulate the common masses. The common masses becomes for them by promoting an ethics of consumerism. That is how they remain in control, like that. And in this case, it would lead to moral hazard. Utilitarianism, it cannot seriously be considered as a as a as a as a as a governing philosophy of a civilization, nor of a society. Yes, at the individualistic individual level, or even at the communal level. But we know that being ethical will require restraint in many cases, and require frustration also in many cases, before you can be truly happy. There is another example that was given, I mean, in the history books or in the philosophy books, about the problems of utilitarianism. Um, Supposing uh, a person, yes, who is in charge of an entire county, like he is a village leader or something like that. And then there is a conquering soldier, or rather a conquering army, who accuses, or rather who said that one of the members of his community will have, I suppose, harm one of his soldiers. And he said that unless this person be surrendered, then the food rations for the entire community will be cut. Yes, this is the sort of thing that would lead to a utilitarian gamble, isn't it? Do you then choose an arbitrary person who is not guilty to be surrendered to the forces, or do you suffer uh, the, the the cut in rations? Either ways, yes, we know that in this case that the moral thing to do is not to be a utilitarian per se, but to understand that morality is much higher than just pleasure. And if you reduce morality to just pleasure, that's not what morality. That's not morality. All right. Do we have any more questions? Well, I'll in that case, since we have gone past the 6 p.m. mark, let us give you all more time to reflect on some of these things. And if you have questions along the way, perhaps you can jot them down, and we can discuss some of them next week, inshallah. With that, I thank you very much for being in attendance. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.